All right.
There we go. Okay. Then I'm going to share my screen with you. Okay. I'll move us to the bottom here.
I named my presentation today as the Holodomor, my family's history. And as you can see, there's a very special caricature of Stalin as he's playing the drums with the bones of Ukraine. Next, please. This is a statue called Bitter Memories of Childhood. You can see there's a child holding some stalks of wheat. This one was placed in Toronto at the exhibition grounds in 2018. There are several copies of this monument in different parts of Canada, and the original one is held at the Holodomor Museum in Kyiv. I hope it's still standing at this point. Why a child? You probably are wondering, why didn't they put grown-ups and or a woman with a child or whatever? 31% of the people who died and were starved to death in Ukraine in 1932 and 1933 were children under the age of 10. As you know, the Russian communists caused the deaths of a lot of people in Ukraine in that year, 7 months, because of their confiscation of food, and not only wheat to be sent abroad, but also the food that they took out of their ovens and anything edible that was around. And the numbers of deaths are still kind of controversial, but there are at least 4 million in the direct area of Ukraine, and they go up to as far as 10 million. So some of it is still being determined. The 5 stalks of wheat that she is holding, this poor emaciated child, is the law that was passed by the Soviet government on August the 7th, 1932, that anyone picking up any stalks of grain from a government field, and all fields were government by that point because they had taken them away from the farmers, would be shot immediately or imprisoned for a period of at least 10 years, even a child. Next, please. So we're going to be talking about this specific genocide, the Holodomor. And one of my favorite quotations is a quotation by Kofi Annan, the former Secretary General of the UN in 1997 to 2006. A genocide begins with the killing of one man, not for what he has done, but because of who he is. So I want you to think about that. So what are we actually looking for in genocide? We're looking for intent, but we're also taking a look as to why certain people are targeted. And it's a question of identity. And the identity could be ethnic, could be religious, racial, for identifying the victims that they decide to deal with. Next, please. I've put together a little, a very simplified form of sort of a chart going from one stage to the next that I think is very useful. It has been useful for me. So the stages of human rights abuse. The first one I think most of us are pretty familiar with is bullying, something we shouldn't be doing. It starts with picking on someone you don't like, some characteristic in some individual, and then eventually other people get involved and they start picking on a person. It can lead to discrimination, because then in the community, someone could start discriminating and saying nasty things and doing nasty things to people that have the same kind of characteristic, whether it's religious, the way they dress, whether it's the language they use or something about their culture. And the third sector is the dehumanization, the put downs of these people, making them feel as if they're not worthy and they're subhuman, as happened in Ukraine with the kulaks and the Ukrainian farmers. They were sometimes stated in their caricatures of the Soviet government to be like rats and parasites. And then the next thing is persecution. That usually happens when the government gets involved. After a while, with a lot of discrimination and dehumanization, if the government supports it, then they pass legislation to make this a legal thing to do. And that's when the real problems start, because then they take actions to do something about dealing with these people and maybe wiping them out as well. So the last stage in this case is genocide. And that's the extreme form of human rights abuse. Next. This is a map of Ukraine. The outer boundaries, as you can see, are the map as it stands today. And the gray part is the area that was affected by the Holodomor, the Ukrainian genocide. And you probably are familiar with some of these names, considering what's going on with Ukraine in the news these days. Next. So what was my motivation to decide to do something about the Holodomor as a teacher of history and social studies? I've been working on the Holodomor for the past 20 years in Canada, and even before that, but formally. Both of my parents, as was said, are survivors of the Holodomor and the Soviet totalitarian system as well as the Nazi regime, which took over Ukraine during World War II. And they were also taken out as slave laborers to work in German factories. Survivor accounts are important pieces of history. We know that we have documents, we have articles, we have letters, we have all kinds of information. But when you can get some information from a survivor, it gives you a better look at what was happening on a daily basis in a society and the after effects on them. And there have been after effects about when people are traumatized. And even the DNA of people, the children of some of the victims, has changed as a result of the trauma. And both my parents are ethnic Ukrainians. My father comes from around the city of Kyiv, the capital, and my mother comes from the Chernihiv region, just about 120 kilometers north of Kyiv, which was bombarded recently and badly. I have known about the Ukrainian genocide as a child and the destruction of the Ukrainian population since I was a baby. I was born in a displaced persons camp in Germany after World War II and lived there for 4.5 years before we emigrated to Canada. My boogeyman as a child, there was always someone they want to scare you with so that you behave yourself, was Stalin. As I had been told by my mother what a terrible person he was, how he starved and killed children without mercy. I heard horrendous stories about the destruction of Ukrainian farmers, religious leaders, intellectuals under Russian communist rule. During World War II, Ukraine, as you probably realize, had been taken over by the Nazis as well. And both the Russians and the Nazis were interested in Ukrainian resources. Ukraine has some of the best black soil in the world for growing wheat and other commodities, and also has mineral resources. And as I mentioned, both my parents ended up in a factory Olympia in the city of Erfurt in East Germany, where they met and where they worked for 1.5 to 2 years. And my mother also ended up spending 2 weeks in a Gestapo prison. And Ukrainians were taken out of Ukraine to work in Nazi in Germany during the war. And only 500,000 made it to the West, either to Canada, the United States, or to Australia. The remainder of the Ukrainians were repatriated or forced to return back to the Soviet Union. There they were either executed or imprisoned for having been in the West and seeing what it was all about, even though it was not their fault. As you can see, they both experienced 2 totalitarian regimes and the destruction of their people by both. Ukrainians had tried to create an independent state from 1917 to 1921, but they were conquered by the Soviet Russian Communist Army, and they were annexed to the Soviet Union. Next. That's me in the middle. This is a kindergarten class when I was 3 years old in Germany. Here we're located in a square where there are army barracks. Those are army barracks. And if you look very closely, I have another picture where you can actually see the bullet holes in it. This is where I learned to walk. So that's where I was in Germany, in a camp with a lot of Ukrainians and others as well. And displaced, the word displaced person simply means a person without a country. And this is what's happening in Ukraine, from Ukraine today, as these people are labeled as displaced persons as well. Next. This is a slide of my father. Ivan Mikhailovsky was 23 years old in this picture taken in 1934. He was born in a village just outside of Kyiv in 1911, and he was the eldest child of 6 children to a well-to-do farming and business community family who were prominent leaders in their village. He witnessed many horrendous events in his youth: the breakup of the Russian Empire, the Russian Revolution, Ukraine's short-lived independence, and of course the takeover by the Soviet communist state in 1922. Ivan himself was arrested at the age of 19 for being the son of a kulak, and I'm sure you know what a kulak is, supposed to be a rich peasant, and had a death sentence reversed because he didn't have higher education. He had been thrown out of school in grade 3 and told that kulaks did not need an education. Next slide. This is where my father was sent, to build the Belomor Canal. This is near the Finnish border in Russia, in the north of the European portion of Russia. And he was there from 1930 to the end of the summer in 1932. There he slaved and saw how the Ukrainian intellectuals, religious and cultural leaders were worked to death. The number of Ukrainians in these camps exceeded other nationalities, even though the Ukrainians made up only 20% of the population of the Soviet Union. Father was released at the end of the summer in 1932, just in time for the escalation of the Holodomor, the Ukrainian famine. He was under surveillance after that, and in and out of prison until the breakout of World War II. He became a mechanic, as he didn't have higher education, and he helped to feed his family as he worked in various jobs in the village with his rations. Next. This is a photograph of my grandfather, Ivan's father and mother. His name was Karpo, and her name was Juliana, probably. I did something quite interesting. My cousins in Ukraine know very little about their background because my grandfather was arrested in 1928, just as the 5-year plan was passed. And he was arrested because he was opposed to collectivization. He did not want to give up his land, and he owned a store. And of course, that was taken away. So he bought himself a mill with another couple of guys. And they put up posters for people not to go to the collective farms. They even burnt down the house of an activist. So he was considered to be an enemy of the people, a kulak, and for the rest of his days, until 1937, he was in prison where he died. My grandmother, with her 6 children, was thrown out of her home in 1930 in the middle of winter at 20 below with a child at her breast. My father was the eldest, but there were young children that were there as well. And the neighbors were told not to help her because she was the scum of the earth. She doesn't deserve any help, an enemy of the people like her husband. And some distant relative of ours let her sleep in the barn for the winter and also probably fed them to some extent. Next. This is the kind of treatment that the kulak, this is not her, but this is similar to what would have happened. That would have been a home, and they would have been thrown out. In this case, my grandmother being thrown out in the middle of winter. Next. This is a picture of my mother. the one on the right-hand side, and that's her sister Vera. She was born in 1922, so there was an 11-year difference between my father and my mother in the Chernihiv Oblast. And she was the first child to survive to my grandparents, Tatiana and Semen, after 4 babies died at birth. At the time of the Holodomor, Nadia was 11 years old and remembers that times were very difficult, even before the famine, for her poor working family, because there were 4 children. Growing up, she owned 1 skirt and 1 blouse, which she wore to school every day and washed every other day. Next. This is her mother, Baba Tatiana. Her mother worked in the kolhos, on the collective farm, from the dusk to dawn. My grandfather, Semen, was a carpenter who worked in the local distilleries, biggest industry in the small town of Ichnya, that produced alcohol. And guess what? They had lots of rye to produce alcohol. And his job at the distillery was to do all the repairs on the machinery. Their home was very modest, and there was a portrait of Taras Shevchenko, the Ukrainian national poet and the freedom fighter of Ukraine, and religious icons. But whenever someone came into the house, they would hide them, and they had to put up a portrait of Stalin. Next. This is a typical home in a village in the 1920s with a thatched roof. We have some of these kind of homes in the prairies in Canada in museums. Next. This is the home of my mother's great aunt, and I was there in 1968. I had a chance to see the inside of it, earthen floor, etc. This great aunt was 97 years old, so she had seen quite a bit of history. And I think she was on her 4th husband at the time. Next. Now, my mother does remembered a number of things. I'm not going to go into all of them, but she and her friend, on walking home from school, encountered a terrible scene. A boy of about 12 was being hit with a stick by a Soviet official for having stolen a great cucumber from a garden. And if you recall, the idea of socialist property, that you cannot touch it, the man actually killed the boy in front of their eyes. And when they protested, he started after them and they took off, and they were lucky to survive. Now, I wanted to also mention something about the distillery. The distillery, as I said, has to use grain to make alcohol. At the end of the fermentation process, what they did was they would take the chaff, the garbage that was left over. They had a huge pit outside of the distillery, and they would dump it once a day. And it was liquid, and people would line the outside of it. Some of them fell into it and drowned. My grandmother would go with 2 pails across her back, carrying them. She would go every day to pick up the chaff. She would wash it. She would dry it. She would then grind it and make some kind of bread for them to survive with any kind of weeds or whatever. One of the things that they were lucky to have was when the Soviets came to take away all their animals and all their equipment and put her on a collective farm, they left the cow because nobody could milk this cow except my grandmother. And I guess the neighboring people knew about it. So they left the cow, which spent the night in the house because anybody who could have caught the cow would have killed it and would have used it for meat. The other thing that happened that saved them was that Nadia's father ended up with pneumonia in 1933 in the winter. And nobody could fix the things he could fix at the distillery. So the director of the distillery sent my grandfather's family and him a sack of grain and a sack of sugar, which kept them going, and they survived. Next. Just to show you the influence in a totalitarian regime, this is an acknowledgement of excellence in education. And I don't know whether you can recognize the 2 gentlemen there. I don't know if I call them gentlemen, but anyway, they are there. Lenin and Stalin. If you can imagine your report card coming home with with Mr. Biden's picture on it. Just think of that. But that's how the totalitarian state actually permeates all aspects of society. Next. And this is just at the museum in Kyiv. I just happened to be there when they were doing a presentation for students. And then they showed some of the weeds that they gathered, all kinds of edible plants that people have picked up. And of course, they ate mushrooms and some of them died because of it. Anything that they could possibly find to survive. Next. So the Holodomor has been denied. By whom? By the Soviets for many generations, over 5 decades, by the Russians today, and other countries as well. It was covered up by a lot of journalists like Walter Duranty of the New York Times. He got a Pulitzer Prize for his coverage of the Soviet Union, and yet he denied it occurred. And other a lot of socialists, it was popular to be a socialist in the 1930s. They didn't want to believe that this utopia could do something like this. And it was ignored by Western governments in the same way that when the war started, Ukraine was on its own. And it took a while for the Western countries to start thinking about the fact that they should support this country. And that was what was happening there was not correct, and certainly against human rights. So for about 5 decades, Ukrainians kept quiet and they didn't do very much because they couldn't do much because of the totalitarian system. Next. Raphael Lemkin, I'm sure you probably know who he is. He's the father of the term genocide. And he made a presentation in 1953 to the Ukrainian community when it was 30 years after the Holodomor. And he said something quite profound. What I want to speak about is perhaps the classic example of Soviet genocide, its longest and broadest experiment in Russification, the destruction of the Ukrainian nation. And that's what he said about the Holodomor. There was always a fear of losing Ukraine. Stalin was very concerned about it. There is a document, this top secret document that actually says it. If we don't crack down on them, we're going to lose Ukraine. Because there were lots of rebellions during the Holodomor, lots of problems. And so they feared that that could possibly happen. And there was another gentleman by the name of Kosior who said, if half of them die, it's okay, basically. I'm just paraphrasing it. But we will have pacified them and the remainder will toe the line. Next. Another person, and he's an American, James Mace. James Mace will have a statue placed for him in Ukrainian cities because he came from the United States where he had worked on the Holodomor for a congressional report. And he did a lot of work on the Holodomor. He came back to Ukraine in the early 90s and he opened up their eyes. They had been forbidden to talk about it. They did not have any information about it. People were afraid to tell their children about it for fear they would say something at school and the whole family would be arrested. So he made this statement. So he forced Ukrainians to look at their history and recreate and to relearn and learn something about their historical past. So he said, I remain convinced that for Stalin to have complete power in his hands, he found it necessary to physically destroy the second largest Soviet republic, meaning the annihilation of the Ukrainian peasantry, the farmers, Ukrainian intelligentsia, Ukrainian language and history as understood by the people, to do away with Ukraine and things Ukrainian as such. The calculation was very simple, very primitive. No people, therefore no separate country, and thus no problem. Such a policy is genocide in the classic sense of the word. He, by the way, was he was American, but he was also Cherokee, half Cherokee, I believe. That, I just wanted to mention it since I'm in the United States right now. Okay, next. I wanted you to also think about this. This is a quotation from another American, a professor from Columbia University. Why is the Holodomor unique among genocides and great crimes against humanity? It sort of differs from the Holocaust, it differs from the Armenian, Rwandan. And the answer that was given is because its last chapter has yet to be written. Now think about what that means. It's not finished, is it? It can continue. Okay, let's go on to the next one. Next slide, please. Here we have a burning house. And the first quotation that's on there says, Ukrainians should suffer for believing that they exist as a separate people. Only this can lead to the redemption of guilt. And guess who said that? Vladimir Putin, just before he invaded Ukraine. He actually stated that he was going to do this. This is the first time that I know in history that the aggressor actually states what he's going to be doing. So to add, and what was the purpose? To add Ukraine to the Russian Empire. Without Ukraine, Russia is not an empire. With Ukraine, it becomes an empire. So it's become something that he wants to do and he feels he has to do. Next slide, please. Just some scenes from what is going on in Ukraine today. As you can see, a lot of destruction and constant bombardment. Next, please. These are female soldiers, believe it or not, in the Ukrainian army. And what is unique is that Putin has labeled Ukrainians as Nazis, not because they have anything to do with Nazi Germany. To be a Nazi means you're not accepting Russian identity. And that was said by Timothy Snyder on Putin's statements that he made in his playbook, or the book that he has written about what his plans are for the future. Next. The majority of the population, so more than 20 million people, are to be killed or sent to work in labor camps to expurgate their guilt for not loving Russia. Another statement by Vladimir Putin. Survivors that remain are to be subject to re-education. They are now sending lots of Ukrainians. They have taken them out of the country. There's over 1 million that the Russians have taken, like almost kidnapping, putting them in buses and then sending them all over the Russian country. And they're going to filtration camps. It's like a concentration camp where they're going to decide whether you are worthwhile having and whether you can be changed and become Russian. Children will be raised to be Russian. And in that case, if there was a mother and a child going into Russia, being sent into Russia by the Russian troops as they came in, like into the city of Mariupol, they would separate them. The children go into an orphanage so they can be re-educated and become Russian citizens. And the name Ukraine will disappear. That's as clear as day in his announcements. Next, please. Again, another sign of destruction in a residential area. And areas where people's homes are not military places. They've bombed cities, they've bombed schools, they've bombed hospitals, they've bombed all kinds of places that have nothing to do with the military. Next. In the city of Kharkiv, that's being bombed as we speak. It's also a city of over 1 million people, and it's the second largest city in Ukraine. Next. This is the city, this was found in the city of Irpin. They found a mass grave site. And these are the bodies that the soldiers, the Ukrainian soldiers that have taken back the city, have put into bags. As you can see, that's a huge number of people. Some of them had been burnt in a crematorium or partially burnt. There are women, children, and men. And these are not military people. These are civilians. Next. Another bridge that was blown up to smithereens. Next. And children. These children, I got the slide, and it looks as if they're children that are going west from the eastern parts of Ukraine to the city of Lviv and possibly going to Poland or to one of the other cities as displaced persons until the war is finished. Hopefully, if they win, they can go home. Otherwise, they'll become refugees, just like I was a refugee at the end of World War II. Next. So, if we take a look at the word genocide, I'm sure you've probably studied the UN Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide of 1948. You can see that it is the following acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. And we've looked at both the Holodomor and what is happening today. Killing members of the group. Is it happening? Think about it. Causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group. The rape of women is considered to be the right thing to do for a Russian soldier. They have actually heard comments of guys speaking to their wives and saying, guess what, they want us to rape. And she said, go ahead. I was shocked by that one. Deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. Taking food away, the Ukrainian grain that was supposed to be exported to African countries and the Middle East has been taken away from along the coasts. They've blocked the coasts. They've taken all this away, and they're stopping the delivery of foodstuff to Ukrainian cities like Mariupol, where they are starving, those who are still remaining there. Imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, and forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. If you take a look at these, and these are the characteristics of a genocide according to the convention, maybe you can compare what happened in the Holodomor to what is happening today. But as that quotation about what makes it unique states, there is the last chapter to be written as yet. Is it a continuation of the same thing? The destruction of the Ukrainian people, wiping out the word Ukrainian from their textbooks, and so forth. Next. Anne Applebaum is a winner of the Pulitzer Prize, and she's written a book called Red Famine. In Russia, the state has ordered publishers to eliminate the word Ukraine from textbooks. An attempt to erase a nation and a people and to leave no trace has begun. Next. The Kenney, I want to tell you that the Canadian Parliament unanimously recognizes Russia's genocide against Ukrainians on April the 27th, 2022. They already had acknowledged the Holodomor. This is what is happening today. So this is the first country to do that so far. A genocidal war. Ukrainians need better help to survive the second genocide in less than a century. It's only been 90 years since the Holodomor. Next. So that brings us, this is my last slide. I hope you have been able to see some of the similarities between the Holodomor and the Russian war on Ukraine today. We as people who live in a democracy, who have the right to think and to act on our convictions, and we are very interested always in human rights and injustices that occur. And I think your teacher, from what I saw of her excellent lesson that she won our award for, she is very concerned about social justice and how we should be living. So I'm sure she has been talking to you about what we as citizens of a democracy, with our values on human life, we cannot just sit and accept injustices when they occur. even if you don't belong to NATO, even if you don't belong to the EU. If a country that is a democracy is struggling to survive, we need to help in some way. And I want to thank the American government for what they have been doing for Ukraine. They are now providing lethal weapons, and they're helping us as much as they can. And I hope that we will be able to prevail, because the victory is not just for Ukraine. This is a fight for democracy. Because Mr. Putin has also said that his further plans are to have a Russian empire from Lisbon, which is in Portugal, all the way to Vladivostok. So what else does he plan to take over? The rest of Europe. Anyway, so I want to encourage you to stand up for your beliefs, stand up and do something when you see even things like bullying starting, so that they don't escalate and don't become a serious concern. And I like this quotation. I am only one, but still I am one. I cannot do everything, but still I can do something. And because I cannot do everything, I will not refuse to do something that I can do. And it's by an American. Anyway, thank you very much for your attention. I'm willing to and happy to answer any questions you may have.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that. Really insightful and unique eyewitness account from your childhood, and then extending it to what's going on today. So let's hear from students. Questions? Who would like to start off with a question? Anybody? Okay. I'm sorry. Could you come up here just so that Ms. Kuryliw can see you? So.
Hello. Hi.
Hello.
Let me know if this is too, if you don't want to talk about this, but on a more personal level, how do you think this has affected you? And if you could talk a little bit about that.
Well, I'm affected. There's no question of it. You know, are you talking about the present day situation or the Holodomor?
I think present day for you, and generational, because that's actually something that I want to do research.
You know, I mean, I was affected by the Holodomor as well. You know, my parents, my father came out with a heart condition from the concentration camp. And he was a very quiet man. He's passed. But, you know, the horror, I could see the pain in his face. You know, he would talk with his buddies and things like that. And I always had to know what was going on. I went into history because of that. I had to find out. And it wasn't being taught at the universities at that time. Today it's being taught. You know, so things have changed. But you are affected by it. And I know that my motivation is to help, you know, in any way I can. I have relatives in Ukraine. First cousins, because my father and my mother were the only ones to go out to the West. They were taken by the Germans and then never came back, you know, so that I have relatives now sitting. There's one in Hungary with a child, another one in the Czech Republic that are going to be coming out, and they're going to stay with me for a while. Hopefully they're leaving their husbands and parents behind, you know, just to make sure that the younger ones get out and are not hurt, you know, so they're going to be wanting to go home.
Right.
So this is, you know, and in some ways, I go to Ukraine to teach as well, by the way. I speak Ukrainian fluently. And I teach teachers how to teach about the Holodomor and genocide and human rights. And I've been doing it. We run a special summer school with one of the professors there that I do this with.
Oh, you've frozen.
They were denied.
Right.
So, you know, so that's how it's affected me. And I try to help. We have fundraising, you know, to help the humanitarian aid and so forth. Like even little things like this, a wreath,
Right.
which is very Ukrainian because girls used to wear these flowers in their hair with ribbons, you know. So somebody's been making them, or the school kids or a community organization, and we give money, and then of course they send the money over and they buy humanitarian aid. So we're trying to do the best we can.
Right. And
Thank you for your question.
Oh, No problem. I have just another thing. How do you
Sure.
identify? Do you identify just Ukrainian or Ukrainian and Canadian or
In Canada, it's okay to be Ukrainian Canadian.
right? Okay. Yeah.
There are, there are 1,400,000 people of Ukrainian background that claim they are Ukrainian. I think there are a lot more. Some of them changed their names already and so forth. But, and we have a population of about 37 million. So that makes it a pretty, pretty strong thing. So that's why we were the first ones to recognize this as a genocide. We know how to use, how to put pressure on our politicians as well.
All right. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Okay. Another question? Okay, great. Maddie, come on up. Oh, sure. I can bring this over to you. Maddie has a boot on her leg, so
Oh, okay.
yeah.
I
Hi,
just thought
Maddie.
it was interesting when you were talking about when you were little and like with your mother and like kind of like how your ideal like boogeyman kind of thing, but instead like you talk about Stalin. I thought that was very interesting because it kind of like just like one of those things that was generational and like as a kid like that's what like kids like feared and stuff like that. So I think that's
Sure.
interesting that you were explaining that stuff.
Yeah. I wonder if Ukrainian kids today if their boogeyman is Putin.
I have a feeling they are. They had a video on. Like I have 2 Ukrainian channels, so I can watch, the news as it comes from over there.
Right.
And there was a little video made about a little girl. She must have been about 4 years old. And she was actually saying what she felt. She said, I don't want to leave my home, but I have to go because of this bad man. But I do not want to speak Russian, she said.
Right, right.
So there must have been a conversation around this. So here's this 4-year-old who speaks beautiful Ukrainian, who is saying she does not want to be forced to speak Russian. So she,
Right.
So something has come through. I mean, the parents are discussing things, but the kid listens. And that's what I did. I used to sit under a table and listen to this surrogate grandfather and my father talking about these things.
Mm. Well, that brings up another question. If his goal is to, let's say, get rid of Ukraine entirely, the name Ukraine wiped off the maps, but still you have this collective language, history, culture, like how, I can't imagine how he thinks he's going to erase that.
He has started, in Mariupol, not Mariupol, one of the other cities in the east that they had conquered. Now the Ukrainians have taken it back. They actually forced the teachers, they got the teachers together and the principals, and they said that they burned the books, the textbooks, the history books. History is a very political thing, especially
Right.
for a guy like him.
Yeah.
So they burned all the history books and they brought in Russian history books with their own interpretation of history, no mention of Ukraine or Ukrainian issues. So you can do that. And Ukrainian language was always second rate. Ukrainians were like second rate citizens in their own country during the Soviet period.
Right.
So, for example, you as a teacher get a salary. You have a union. You know what you're supposed to be paid. In Ukraine, you could have taught in a Ukrainian school or you could teach in a Russian school. If you taught in a Ukrainian school, your salary was lower than the one in the Russian school.
Mm. Mm.
There was always the discrimination. If you wanted a job with the government, and the government is the only act in town during Soviet times, because everything is a communist system, there's no private businesses or anything like that, you had to speak Russian. So there was this kind of, so there was a lot of discrimination.
Right, right.
And so you can do it. You can outlaw things.
Yes, right, right. When you have a totalitarian
When you
regime.
have a totalitarian system, exactly. And that's exactly what has been happening, that you take a look at a lot of these major genocides, usually they're pretty well either dictatorships or very much authoritarian regimes that can do as they please. Now, like, the Holocaust and let's say the Armenian was in a wartime situation, but the Holodomor was not.
Right.
It was during a peacetime. It was one of these genocides that was conducted in peacetime. And none of the countries, all these Americans knew, Canadians knew, but they were trying to sell things. It's the Depression. There's no money around here. We might have the same kind of thing with the coming up of the gasoline prices at the moment, right?
Right.
I mean, people are starting to say, well, Ukrainians aren't responsible for that. They didn't invade anybody. The Russians invaded.
Right.
And they're causing the havoc. So I hope there's not going to be that backlash against Ukrainians because they didn't do anything.
Right. Exactly.
And this time, at least we're getting support because I think the Western world is now realizing that this guy's out to destroy democracy. And he's going to have friends in China, North Korea, and there are a few others around that are, So you have to think about the fact that the world order is changing. And one of the professors that I love to read about is Timothy Snyder. He's the one who wrote the book Bloodlands. And he has a sort of a very interesting concept of what the world is going to look like. And the 21st century is going to look a lot different than it has up to now. So we have to be aware of the whole world situation.
Right.
And even our Arctic, like you have only Alaska, we have a huge Arctic in Canada.
Yeah.
And they're all over with their submarines and their boats, trying to muscle in. We have problems.
Right. Another question I think that a lot of us are asking is, why now for Putin? What do you think struck him as this being the ideal time to attack Ukraine?
I heard, I read this and that. I heard that maybe he has some health issues. I don't know.
We've been hearing that too. I don't know.
I don't know. Like he's like the Roman emperors in the sense, he's living in a bunker beautifully with probably gold everywhere because he's one of the richest men in the world. Gotten illegally, but still he's done it. And he's isolated himself from people. And so who knows what's going on, with him. So I have a feeling he thinks this is the right time to do it. And I think he felt there were a lot of the Ukraine people who are running away from the East. A lot of them do speak Russian as their first language because that's the way their parents wanted to protect their children. Because if you were walking around with an embroidered shirt, during the Russian Revolution, they would shoot you on the spot. For wearing an embroidered shirt, which is a sign of being Ukrainian. That's what my father told me. He was, he was a young man at the time. So that's the kind of stuff that was going on. So, I don't know what the answer is, but the point is that I think his time is running out. He's 69 years old. He has a young lady friend, but still, he's 69 years old. And I guess he figured that he was under the illusion that these people who speak Russian are going to support him. And he thought all he had to do was walk in. Well, when he walked into Donbass and Luhansk, they didn't. He had to kill enough of them to make sure, and the rest of them kept quiet, or he sent them off to the gulag, So basically, these people didn't know their history. But with the independence in 1991, a number of Western historians of Ukrainian background have written. One in particular, he was an American, by the way, Oris Subtelny. He was at Harvard for a while. He wrote a history of Ukraine, and it was translated into Ukrainian. But the big miracle was not translated in Ukrainian, but to translate it also into Russian. So these people who were Russian speakers and had forgotten their language learned about their history. They found out why they were speaking Russian. It's not their fault. They were, a lot of them are changing. They are learning, or they know Ukrainian and they're doing it. I know the younger generation, like we were talking about generational things, the younger generation speak Ukrainian, even if their parents didn't, because they say this is our country and that's what we have to do.
Right. It's funny how language can become so political,
It always bothered me. It always bothered me when I used to travel to Ukraine, because I've been to Donetsk. I taught in Donetsk. I taught in Odessa, that's being bombed to smithereens, and in Kharkiv. And, you know, I've been all over the place. And, you know, some of the teachers couldn't speak to me in Ukrainian.
Right, right.
But I know Russian because I studied it at university. But one time I told them, I said, do not assume that every Ukrainian is born as part of our DNA to speak Russian. I said,
Right.
it's not part of mine.
Yeah.
I grew up in a completely different environment. I
Yeah.
speak French and from Canada.
Right, right. So we've noticed, Valentina, so many similarities between, like, I know the Ukrainian genocide was very different, but also we see these, you know, same things, the targeting of a particular group, mass killing, slave labor, re-education, right? And I know that some of the Russian soldiers that are raping women are saying, we want you to get pregnant with Russian babies, which is
Yes,
just, yeah,
unbelievable. Yeah.
yeah, unbelievable. So there are similarities too, yes?
Yes, there definitely are. Definitely are. You know, we, for a long time, Ukrainian historians didn't want to use imperialism, but it is imperialism. You're creating an empire. And
Yeah.
as one of your, Brzezinski, one of the, I can't remember which president, he was one of his advisors, said, Russia with Ukraine is an empire. Without
Right.
Ukraine, it is just an ordinary country.
Right.
Because Ukraine is a large country with lots of mineral wealth, et cetera, et cetera. You know, so basically, that's colonialism, whether we like to say it or not. But
Yeah.
it is colonialism, and it makes the people that are you conquer to be second-rate citizens. And you do with them as you want. And that's usually authoritarianism too. I mean,
Right, right. Does anybody have any further questions? Okay, well, I'm going to turn this around so you can see everybody, and let's have a nice round of applause. Thank you so much. Thank you for being here today. We really appreciate it, Ms. Kuryliw.
Oh, you're welcome.
Okay, and I will hope to talk to you soon.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for asking me. Thank you.
Take care. Bye now.
Bye.